Well, great to see everyone here today. Thanks so much for coming out to the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. My name is Michelle Lantieri. I'm the head curator here working on the exhibition projects. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to the third session of our Meet the Architects and Designers Pueblo Architecture Today series. We've got some great speakers here today. And so there's 5 programs in total for this series. There's 2 more after this. And this series is in conjunction with the exhibition Restoring Our Heart Places, Contemporary Pueblo Architecture. And you'll be able to see that after the talk here just in the South Gallery, just here in the South Wing. We're really excited today to have our curators here for the exhibition, Dr. Ted Hahola and Dr. Lynn Paxson. We want to go ahead and give them a round of applause for their work. And we're really excited that they were able to bring together all of these different architects and designers so that we can really get that in-depth view of what's going on in Native American architecture and design in the Southwest today. So we're really excited to hear from our guest speakers today, Miriam Diddy and also Garron Yepa, if we want to give them a round of applause. And so a little bit about the exhibition, Restoring Our Heart Places, Contemporary Pueblo Architecture is guest curated by the University of New Mexico's School of Architecture and Planning, Indigenous Design and Planning Institute, in partnership with the IPCC. We're really honored to collaborate with Dr. Ted Hahola of Isleta Pueblo and Dr. Lynn Paxson. And we're just really in awe of the way that they've been able to work on the exhibition and highlight Pueblo architecture as it's changing, focusing on revival and transformation, but also connecting it to its origins. So we're really excited for you to also see the exhibition after the talk if you haven't seen it yet. And so this series brings that future element to all of us today and through August, and so we can really get a sense of where this field is going. And we want to give a special thanks to the New Mexico Humanities Council. They are our primary sponsor for this program series. So let's give them a round of applause. They're working really hard too. And we're just really excited to be able to bring this kind of content to you by way of this discussion. So really happy that everyone's here. And I wanted to tell you what the next program is and then introduce our curators. So the next program after this will be on June 28th. It's going to feature Theodore Adaki and Juliette Pino, and it's going to focus on different kinds of architectural firms in the Southwest. And I hope you'll be able to join us for that as well, and differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous architectural and design firms. And so our guest curators seated over here. So Dr. Ted Hahola is a distinguished professor and Regents Professor in the Community and Regional Planning Program, School of Architecture and Planning, University of New Mexico. He holds a PhD in Political Science from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and he also has a Master's in City Planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a BFA in Architecture from UNM. He founded the UNM Indigenous Design and Planning Institute and co-founded the Indigenous Planning Division of the American Planning Association. So thank you, Ted, for all of that. That seems like quite the journey. So we're glad that you're here today. And Dr. Lynn Paxson is an Emerita Professor of Architecture at Iowa State University. And she holds degrees in both design and social science and is interested in architecture and design as cultural phenomena. She is a member of the American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers, and she's been recognized by the American Collegiate Schools of Architecture for her work in diversifying the architecture curriculum through Native cultures and issues. Thank you for all your work, Lynn. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to the curators, and you'll hear more about your guest speakers today.
So how's everybody today? It's Saturday morning. We just came back from T-Ball, right, Theo? So We are really happy to be hosting this particular conversation. It's one that I think still hasn't really resolved itself within our Pueblo communities and actually within the whole of Native America. And that's really the impact that housing has had within our communities. And in particular, those of you that have had the chance to go into the exhibit, you know that we've got one section there that begins to have this discussion about HUD housing and essentially the kind of situation that emerged, which we now call a cookie cutting kind of approach, which essentially brings this kind of agency from the federal government, which has really, in a sense, imposed its own standard way of dealing with subsidized housing, but not necessarily in a way that is really very in tune with the kind of cultural and the kind of social aspects of the houses that have been kind of the traditional mainstay. And Pueblo communities in particular have been really impacted by this, simply from the kind of standpoint of how it is that the hard place really existed in an indigenous form in traditional houses, which were basically invested with adobe and stone types of traditions, and also reflected essentially the sort of cycle of family within the community. Suddenly became disrupted as a result of the introduction of HUD housing, which impacted both the kind of land uses, but also nucleated the family to an enormous extent, to the point where essentially the hard places, which were the center of the communities, were really abandoned, and it's characterized as this kind of donut effect where the hard places now have become largely ceremonialized. The people and family only occupy those during ceremonial times, and the rest of the time you hardly see any families that are living within this area. There's many kinds of reasons and stories for this, but the kind of situation that is occurring is that there are now some communities that are beginning to sort of, in a systematic way, the exhibit that's called Rematriating the Village. And this is the effort of some of those communities to think about how it is that they can bring that life. And from many of the conversations that have ensued and occurred within these communities, what the elders are saying in terms of their experience of growing up and what they see now is their goal is to bring the children back into that space. So I think it's really important to sort of think about that from a kind of a consensus community type of context. But then the second iteration of that, which is what I think we're going to see in today's presentation, is what's the alternative? And now there has been reform within HUD housing. It's called NAHASTA, which is another iteration that allows tribes to actually take control of the style of housing that they are going to pursue and make it much more cultural and meaningful in terms of their approaches, in terms of how they see their own resiliency within their own communities. But it's still in the sense of dealing with process, another kind of uphill road, because unfortunately much of the housing initiatives have really still been driven by economy. And as you all know, when you talk about traditional housing, such as adobe housing, it's both resource intensive, it's labor intensive, and that kind of is the Achilles heel as to why a lot of tribes have not pursued this, simply because it just costs so much per square foot to do an adobe house, including then dealing with all the kinds of codes and standards that are necessary for that. But it's kind of ironic that in '62, the first prototypes that were actually developed by 8 Northern were adobe houses. And it was in their kind of verve to try and actually institute that they received a lot of pushback, and they had to then lay the groundwork for what eventually has become the standards for adobe architecture, which are still used in terms of modern techniques to this particular day. So that's the irony, is that they started it, they developed the foundation for the sort of modern transformation of this, but yet if you actually look at this kind of housing within Pueblo communities, it's still almost non-existent. And it's only done by individuals who themselves sort of take on that particular challenge, but in terms of the industry, it's still not there. So I think, this is essentially what's being pursued by our young people that are coming into the profession to really begin to sort of think through and build things that are much more responsive and responsible. So I'll just end that in terms of sort of laying the foundation, and we're going to turn it over to my colleague Lynn so she can introduce our guests and also make some remarks as well, too. So Lynn?
Excuse me for not standing up. CEO Telekini. Garron Yepa is heritage from both Jemez and Diné. He has a BA from Dartmouth in engineering and native studies, and MArch from the University of New Mexico. He's on the board of Cornerstone's Community Partnerships and serves on the community partnership, community partnership that serves for the Cultural Properties Review Committee in New Mexico State Historic Preservation Office. Big mouthful. Garron's grounded in his communities, and he brings a unique perspective through his cultural and regional knowledge to his work. He joined MOS through their joining with AOS, and he's been there many years. He's a senior designer. He does commercial interiors, affordable housing, hospitality, historic preservation, and this is all informed by his cultural knowledge, and being a fluent Post speaker, it's given him a different way to maybe think about describing the world around him. Miriam Diddy is Diné and Hopi. She's a senior planner at Planned Collaboration, also collaborative. Sorry, and that's here in Albuquerque. She has 10 years of experience in mapping, planning, and community experience. She's worked with 11 different pueblos, assisting with building assessment and housing design initiatives for Zuni, Laguna, Okewinge, and Hua. She's a graduate of the University of New Mexico, and her focus is to bridge contemporary built environments with cultural narratives, and she's passionate about data sovereignty and honoring the resiliency of Indigenous people in that way. She's active in the Society of Architecture, Planning, and Design, the American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers, American Planning Association Tribal Indigenous Planning Division, and is a board member for Creative Startups. And if that were not enough, she's also a visual artist, and her work echoes the connections between ancestral mapping techniques and modern graffiti and concepts of Indigenous futurity. Garron and Miriam worked together at the firm of AOS, or Edkin Olsen Shea, before joined with MOS. And while they bring different educational backgrounds to the table, they're both passionate about creating places that provide supportive environments for Indigenous people, which support their values and needs. And we're hoping in this session that they'll have a chance to discuss the work and present and discuss project types, particularly in terms of historic preservation, where they've had some impact on government policies that have included impacting those government policies to take into account Indigenous perspectives on what is historic, or how we understand historic. And Miriam has developed an app which also makes it easy for community members, well, I'll put easy in quotes, for community members to evaluate and collect information about existing tribal buildings in terms of both documenting their quality, potential repair, upgrade kinds of things. And this app helps different indigenous nations to have sovereignty over the data while they're still able to use it to get the money and support they need from various grants and funding programs. So please help us welcome Miriam and Garron.
Wow, thank you for that introduction, Lynn and Ted, and everyone here who's been supporting this event. I know that there's several other speakers series, and just feeling really honored to be taking part in the exhibit in its formation, as well as today's talk. As mentioned, my name is Garron Yepa. I'm a descendant of both Diné and Hamish peoples. I see some of you in the audience who are my direct kin, so thank you for showing up. I think Miriam and I have a very kind of long relationship, just in terms of our professional and personal lives. So it's like really nice to be able to share this time with her and talk about some of the work we've been up to. So we'll kind of go through some of the presentation we pulled together today, and hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. And also I'm trying to highlight some of the concepts and ideas that are in the exhibit itself. So please make some time and check that out when we finish it. So as mentioned, I'm a senior designer at Mass Design Group. Mass Design Group is a nonprofit architecture and design firm. We're based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We have offices in Kigali, Poughkeepsie, and Boston. I've been with the office since 2022, so fairly recent, but have been working with Miriam and the AOS group in Santa Fe for about a decade prior to that. Our focus there was a lot of tribal work, but in the midst of kind of being really involved in this profession, you kind of get a lot of microphones handed to you, case in point today. So I have been able to kind of take on some additional duties as a city commissioner with the Community Development Commission, which is a city appointed, mayor appointed position. Myself and 5 other commissioners help to kind of usher in the federal standards for community block development grants, as well as affordable housing trust fund and HUD monies that the city receives, and we usher them to the right places, hopefully. And so that is a position I've held for a couple years now. And it's really just exciting to see how communities like Santa Fe are able to kind of allocate resources. And it's indicative of how a lot of our work is inherently political. So that's something to kind of keep in mind with a lot of what we're going to show today. There is a lot of, social and political will that needs to happen. Another organization I'm a part of is a state position, as mentioned in the bio. It's the Cultural Properties Review Committee, which is a governor-appointed position. I serve as well as Ron Toya, who's a member of the Jemez Pueblo, and Elizabeth Swina, who's also an Indigenous Pueblo architect. So it's really great to have representation at that level. That body is primarily focused on entering state properties into the historic record for both the state and national historic records. And so we review a lot of that, those applications as they come across the state, and also review tax credits for historic properties. I'm chair of the subcommittee that's focused on a fairly new fund that was appropriated for just over $1 million for tax credit projects that are municipally owned, so government-owned properties that are in need of repair, with the emphasis of historic improvements. Also happy to see some of my Cornerstones colleagues here. I'm a board member for Cornerstones. I've been serving, I believe, 2 terms. I think we have a 3-term limit, but it's been a really great organization. It's a nonprofit in northern New Mexico that focuses on urban architecture. A lot of our work has been in the kind of churches and spiritual buildings, but hoping to get a lot more work in the tribal sphere. It's been a great organization to be a part of. Also, more recently, we just established a NOMA chapter, which, if you don't know, is the National Organization of Minority Architects. We just established a New Mexico chapter this past year, and so I was a founding member of that as well. In addition to all of the other things, I'm a husband, my wife is present, hi Monica, I think Miriam and I, we just have go-get-it attitudes. We're really excited about the work we do, and hopefully we want to show some of that here real briefly. This is kind of a little bit of snapshots of kind of both my family life. Grew up as an urban Indian on the west side of Albuquerque. If you know the West Mesa, you might know where that picture's taken. Those are my nieces and their dogs. They're much older now. And then my Choctaw Yazi family and my Jemez family. I wouldn't be here without them, so just happy they're here. Didn't expect to be choked up, but so I did go to undergrad in the East Coast, so to Dartmouth College. So I spent 4 years out there. I took an internship in Alaska in Anchorage, working for the environmental program there. 10 weeks is pretty amazing in Alaska. I would recommend it to anyone. And then also spent a few years in New York, but I currently call Santa Fe home. I think this is all important in the way that, understanding kind of your upbringing, your life experiences all kind of filter into your design eye. My master's project at UNM was, believe it or not, a round earth project for an agricultural school in the South Valley. Just some really early sketches of where that work led to. I did while I was in the graduate program, I was working for Miriam's mother, Beverly Diddy, who's also in the exhibit. It is a small world, and you'll see that. I see a lot of friendly faces here, so keep that in mind. As this is something that's really exciting to start with, but it's really important to kind of maintain a lot of the voices that are being upheld here. But Beverly was gracious enough to offer me a role with her small firm, an interior design firm, and we worked on a lot of school projects together, most notably probably IA's campus. This was a school at Tohatchi. You can see my design was actually built. That's the first thing I've done. And then while I worked at AOS, some of my early projects were higher ed with New Mexico State University Student Center. It was a Corbett Center. It was a renovation of their student center. SMU in Taos, most may not know that Southern Methodist University has a campus in Taos. We created kind of I would call it like a living room for their community. It's a small school, but it's like kind of a dorm situation. And then also work at St. Augustine there at Isleta. It is a kind of a Sunday school, for lack of a better term, but it's adjacent to the historic church, which is a beautiful structure made of adobe. The school, we were able to maintain the front. Here's a kind of updated view of some of those projects. But it was terron, which is one type of adobe materiality, but we were able to kind of repair it and then build a steel structure behind it. And so you'll notice that there's a lot of mixing of different building materials in what we're going to show today. But it's important to keep in mind that our job is often schedule driven, budget driven, decision driven. So we have to make those tough decisions. We can't have everything out of Adobe, even if we want to. Sometimes it's just a difficult span to accommodate contemporary activities. One of the first projects I was able to do from beginning to end was also a historic preservation project. It was the first John Gawanin building on UNM main campus after World War II. And it is faux adobe, so it's CMU or Pental block, but it looks like the rest of the campus. And this was once a pharmacy lab, and it was kind of interesting to see that there was a lot of murals that depicted Indigenous people and regional kind of wildlife of the pharmacy curriculum. But here we are now transforming it into a paleontological specimen repository. So in other words, dinosaur bones are held here. And so we had to meet very strict DOI standards for temperature and humidity controls, as well as prep labs and classroom spaces. But it's a real challenge to work in a main campus with a limited budget, maintaining historical accuracy, I guess, and provide all these new facilities from within, including lab spaces, all during COVID. So that was the epic kind of culmination of my early work. And so here are some pictures of it completed, the grand opening ceremony. And so Miriam, I think these are, again, as you come up, I just wanted to say that, we're both very dynamic, and I think one thing to note is that our ancestors were also very dynamic. We call us Renaissance man or Renaissance people. I think that's something to kind of keep in mind, which is why we're sharing so much of our personal lives.
Yate, she Miriam Diddy, she, Tachini Nashli, meaning Babachi, Kia Ani Gashachere, Deli Korean Gashinali, the Coach Ego, Diné Nashli. Hi, so my name is Miriam Diddy, I'm Diné in Hopi, and I'm a senior planner with Plan Collaborative, which is based here in New Mexico. It's the largest landscape architecture and planning firm, but because that's not enough, I wear also a number of other hats here. So I'm also region director for the Indigenous Society of Architecture, Planning and Design. And then also secretary for the American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers, which both Lynn and Garron have been a part of. And then there's a few other members here, including Theo, who's our current vice president in the audience. And then I'm also, again, current member and past steering committee member for the APA Tribal and Indigenous Planning Division, which Ted helped founded. So kind of, I first wanted to set the tone here. I'm, again, from a few different places, but was born and raised here in Albuquerque, but also grew up in Shiprock, in Hopi, from the village of Kokotsmovie or K-Town. And if you're confused by the map, you may notice that north is not up. I often like to explore kind of counter mapping and kind of decolonize methods of mapping, as Lynn kind of mentioned. So east is on the top of the map here, which is an important direction for my culture. And so from many of these places that I've grown up in, it's really influenced my design, I feel, and really how I understand my connections to the land. So really, I feel that I exist with the land around me, not just on the land. So here's kind of a few of my art pieces I've created over the years that kind of show, again, those different places and landscapes in both urban areas and on the res. But also, I'm not just in a relationship with the land. I'm also a part of a larger family. Here's some of my people, all of whom have raised me and helped guide me along my life. So first on the top left, my grandmother. She just turned 85 and is the matriarch of our family currently. And yeah, she and I are descended from Lady White Rock, which is my great grandmother and a survivor of the Long Walk. So I carry that strong spirit with me. I feel I'm in practice. And then my mother and sister on the bottom left. My mother is an interior designer who employed Garron, but she's also featured in the exhibit here. But again, kind of without her, I feel like I wouldn't be in this profession because I got to witness her doing punch lists, CAD work, and designing these spaces, and I'm like, wow, somebody is like really cool and like this is something that I could do too in the future. And then kind of here on the top is my grandfather, and he's Hopi, and we're both descended from Chief Loloma. He's my great grandfather. And then lastly, the most important relative today is Garron on the top right. So he's been like my big brother, I feel, guiding me through life and in my professional career. So
I'm not going to recreate that.
No, yeah, this is a long time ago. I think I was 13. I don't even know how old you are. But I wanted to touch a little bit about my own kind of background. So a lot of my planning knowledge, I feel, was again kindled at an early age growing up, both on my Diné and Hopi side. So I was taught different approaches for planning principles that reinforce our connections to the land, seasons, directions, and again, concepts of multi-generational planning. So that kind of creates a framework, I feel, for my knowledge, which is kind of echoed today with modern planning and design principles for sustainability, climate adaptation, quality of life, mental health, and physical health, and kind of even shows kind of phases of planning. So thinking, programming, performing, action, and kind of thinking about future goals too. So some of you may be familiar with this show, Reservation Dogs. But if you recall this scene, so a young man introduces himself as a young elder. And we joke about the humor in that, but I think there's some truth to this and how we're actually what I like to call future ancestors. So we're really thinking about the generations behind us, but also everyone that's going to come after us in our practice. So using that cultural knowledge, I really aim again to plan with my ancestors, I feel. So this is kind of also called multi-generational planning and design, also known as the 7 generations model. So really considering, designing for the past, present, and future in mind. And it's really, again, it's all in the family. The great granddaughter, granddaughter, daughter, cousin, auntie, but future ancestor. I also kind of, I feel kind of look through a Diné way, I call it. So considering cardinal directions in planning, seasonal changes, and really designing for all of life cycles from birth to death and every generation and stage in between. So here's a few examples below, and then on the right, kind of showing how I kind of translate this knowledge into planning, building, and site design, and even mapping. So one example being the Equinox House, which is here, and this is also kind of shown in the exhibit as well, but it kind of reinforces how we exist with the land around us, not just on the land. So this was a temporary installation that I designed with my colleague Angelica Gallegos, who's also featured in the exhibit. And the Equinox House, again, was taking cues from the cardinal directions. We had created constellation maps, kind of shown on the middle left there, that aligned with the equinox on September 23rd, 2 years ago. And then, Oh, and then yes, so the bottom left is our Indigenous exit signage. I have a sample of it over here. You can look at it after later, but yeah. I weaved that. It took a long time, but so in practice, how do we translate these Indigenous values into our everyday methods of planning and designing? So first, I often kind of encourage us using our cultural education from our family and from your streets wherever you're from, but telling your audience and the communities that you're working with, what's your street cred and show what you represent as an outsider. But we always kind of think about multi-generation, so involving infants, youth, adults, and elders in the design and engagement practices. So for several programming and different meetings that I've hosted, I've designed kind of model building stations for kids and even mapping and drawing exercises. So we're capturing their needs. And some also kind of different youth workshops are a great way to also provide mentorship and promote education at an early age. So again, it's offering ways for kids to see firsthand, the power of planning and how it impacts the built environment. And it's even more cool when they see somebody that kind of looks like them, like, oh, hey, this is kind of a potential career path that I can follow too. So there's kind of some examples here of different engagement and activities I've hosted over the years. One on the top right was for a recreational planning project in Four Corners. So we had engaged tribal members at the Northern Navajo Nation Fair in Shiprock, where I'm from. And I'm getting PTSD thinking about it because this was the largest engagement event that I held. So we first had set up a table at the Youth Day festivities, and we had engaged 854 people over 3 hours that morning, which was great. And then we had to pack up and then set up at the Elder Fest that same afternoon. So we got to have a little, and then we had a more low-key engagement with about 150 elders. So. But here's just kind of, I'll kind of breeze through these fast. So again, some more works I've done over the years. Now that I'm at a landscape architecture firm, I've done a lot of more site design and programming work. So this one's for the Red Lake Chapter House. So kind of translating that knowledge into site design and also plant selection. So thinking about the grasses forms, brushes, trees, and cacti as different generations, and how that kind of can inform design. On the bottom was another project, an art installation that I worked with Garron and Winoka, and then my sister as well, Forgotten Souls. So this was in the middle of the pandemic, and I was kind of bored, but we had got funding from the Time Now New Mexico Art Series, and we created an installation at the Fort Sumner Bosque Redondo Memorial. And that installation included getting donated shoes from, I forgot how many, nearly like over 250 shoes. It did not smell great, but the installation was up for a summer at the memorial site. And this was, again, to represent the long walk and all the people that we lost. So a couple other ones, some projects I worked on currently for Garron Pueblo for the Haku Community Academy. So translating that Indigenous knowledge to site design and programming, as well as material selection. And then another project I'm actually currently working on with NACA, which is the Native American Community Academy just across the street. So we've been involved in hosting kind of rainwater harvesting, I guess model building, and then also education. So teaching them how can we design with the land and harvest water sustainably and create basins and a garden on site. That's also educational. And then again, there's many more Indigenous designers. A few of them here in this room as well. So both Garron and I, again, are in front of AICIE, and then these are just a few snapshots of a few other designers from around the globe.
So this is just a snapshot from our 2-day convening. I was fortunate enough to organize. Thank you, Cornerstones and the Getty and Chamisa organizations who provided scholarships to TERRA, which is the 13th Congress on American Urban Architecture International Conference, and it's really kind of the both scholastic and social connection for a lot of Adobe throughout the world. They supported Indigenous folks. It was held in Santa Fe in 2022. So they supported Indigenous participation with scholarships. We didn't use all that money, and I found an opportunity to be able to kind of use the remaining funds to set up a 2-day kind of convening with previous scholarship applicants. And also thank you to Santa Clara Pueblo who hosted us. We had a walking tour of the Puya Cliffs, and if you don't know, that's a tribally owned historic site on top of a mesa there at Santa Clara. I would recommend everyone to go. We had dinner at the feasting place, which is the upper right. You can see it was all cooked in the Horno from Tomasita Duran's family, and it was meatballs, sliders, all these things that we don't have to have Pueblo or feast food every time we get together. There's pizzas and things we can do. So that was a really exciting way to kind of come together, but also learn about how to cook in our Hornos. And then the following day we had presentations. Wanted to highlight Sherelle Brown, who's also featured in the exhibit, gave a presentation on her work in her community at Kiwa, and Brian Bio and Tomasita Duran talked about their work as well. And then we concluded with, in the center top, assessment of an Adobe home on the plaza. It was really a great way to kind of learn from experts what they look for, what types of condition assessments, designations would be used, and it's just a really engaging way to kind of understand what those who may not have experience can start to understand about their communities. And the assessment was shared with all attendees once it was complete, so that was a really great way to kind of see what we saw in person and translate it into the document that then got used to seek additional funds. And then finally, I think we visited one more house that was recently renovated. So it was a really great way to, it's just like-minded people who are interested. And so we hope to kind of continue this work. But we're here today to talk about housing about an hour later, right? So I think this is all important because there is a strong need, kind of an important need that you can tell from our presentations and our life journeys that is something that's inherent with a lot of people. And I think even those of you in the room are probably interested in what this means. You know, what does heritage mean to Indigenous peoples, and for whom are Indigenous places preserved? And I think that's the real fundamental question. And so I hope to kind of walk through some of the policies and different aspects of how tribes are looked at and how tribes see themselves in this dynamic. Hopefully it's obvious, you know, that what we're really talking about is the resiliency of culture and the preservation of not just material places, but our people's histories and legacies. So very quickly, there's a few documented examples of how heritage values have evolved in international charters. Aloha Survival is like the first to distinguish between heritage values, which were kind of different values, but really focused on kind of age. And the Ecomos Venice Charter in 1964 kind of evolved that, but really kind of focused more on the timing, or how long things existed and what their aesthetic kind of contributions are. Next, the World Heritage Charter added science and ethnological and natural values. It was the first to kind of establish the foundation of our profession of what we kind of understand as outstanding universal value, which is kind of a challenging thing to like consensus about value. Does that really even make sense? It feels very kind of European or academic, which we'll kind of see how that evolves over time. But there's kind of like this pendulum starting to form of like, oh, everyone knows it's important, that way we know it should be preserved, versus kind of a little bit more like free thought about what should be preserved. And so we see the SOI standards with just tying these in place, very clean and easy way to think about it. But then the Ecomos again convened in 1979, and they started to kind of kind of double down on those early values about tradition and historic preservation values. And then you can kind of see that they started to pull in spiritual and social aspects into the definition, but still mostly focused on this outstanding universal value. I think a big kind of progression in the kind of thought of these is the traditional cultural place work that was done. This is still a really important, pivotal piece of kind of thought that tribes are able to leverage for their spaces, and I'll explore that a little more. But then again, it kind of goes back into this like universal value, and then it kind of just gets crazy, right? Because I think we're at a place now where definitions are kind of meaning different things to different people, but in the end, they're really, what we really need to value is what the community itself values, and not universal value. It's just hard to come to consensus on these types of things. So in Pueblo communities, you'll see in the exhibit that buildings are understood to be alive. During their service, they are cared for and nourished, but just like Pueblo people who emerge from the earth fully formed, the buildings are born from the earth and they are meant to return. Preservation of these adobe walls isn't supposed to be. It's at least not the conventional term of preservation. So here's the oldest image of the first example project I'm going to highlight. This is a photo of Okeawenge that was taken in 1877. This image shows the place in a moment of tremendous transition. Note there's ladders because most people entered the dwellings from the roof hatch. But there are some doors, you can start to see them kind of popping in at this point in time. And so the elders ask, if you ask an elder, when is your period of significance, which is a very common term in preservation, some might even say it's tomorrow. So that's a really radical mindset when it comes to this kind of thought about preserving spaces. And so, this is not something an outsider can say, no, it has to be this time. And even like at the time timeline below, this village has existed over 550 years before the advent of photography. So even this is not, anything. It's just a snapshot of when technology kind of came to this space. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic that plays out. So understanding that this temporal shift in preservation thinking is critical for resiliency and particularly traditional communities. So one of those kind of pendulum swings was this intangible preservation, which is mapped out by UNESCO. It mapped out thousands of related concepts that they titled intangible preservation. And it's really just a visualization of all the different kind of aspects of culture and humanity that kind of unite us as human beings, right? We all have 10 toes, 10 fingers, hopefully, but there's a lot of things that kind of unite us in the way that we are social beings. And returning back to that fundamental question of be preserved if you look at these photos, it's just like, should we preserve these handprints of earthen plaster in these photos? For those of us who have done that work, we understand that's kind of foolish because that's probably the third coat that year. It's not that significant. But it would seem then that there should be preserved like the practice of maintenance or the technique of application or the quote know-how of care, the language used to describe that, the smell of wet dirt, and the relationship to where these materials came from. So that seems to be a little bit more in keeping with Pueblo values. Another way to think about more broadly about how present day tribes can reinforce their connection to their place is the National Register's recognition of traditional cultural places. It's a concept that really evolves around traditional community invoking federal preservation policy to prevent change at a place they hold dear, but no longer fully, quote, control. Many places determined eligible for the National Register under this concept are Indigenous sacred sites, now under the control of government, which is a direct result of relocation, reservation efforts, and federal Indian policy. You can see kind of maybe Mount Taylor is the nearest one that multiple tribes could have an attachment to. And of course, that is a source for a multitude of things, including pollinators, stone, flint, lumber, and so on and so forth. You can continue on. But there are other indigenous traditional cultural places that remain in the hands of tribes, and many of these places were among the first districts to be added to the National Register in the 1960s. Advances in federal self-determination policy and the notion of a TCP have enabled the Pueblo tribes to develop plans to maintain their villages according to their own heritage values. The UN Declaration on Indian Rights, which the US has signed, further recognizes fundamental indigenous rights to control their land and their own cultural evolution. Some Pueblos are renowned for resistance to change, while others view preservation with skepticism. Most seek to extend the palpability of the past, while many are just as interested in meeting the needs of modern life in these ancient places. So highlighted here are Okeo-Wenge, Taos, and Zuni. There are, as many of you probably know, we're at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. There are 21 Pueblo tribes, 19 in Mexico, 1 in Texas, and 1 in Arizona. Among these places and present-day communities speak 6 languages and maintain the oldest continuous architectural traditions in the U.S. I think that's a point of pride for me as someone who works in this field. But we've occupied these lands since time immemorial, and the concept of reserved land has only come to this region with the European notions of land ownership. So I'm going to hopefully dive into Okeo-Wenge real quickly and kind of see how in the case study form a lot of these topics are kind of brought up and touched upon. So Okeo-Wenge translates to the place of the strong people. It's the people of Okeo-Wenge are located at the confluence of the Rio Grande and Rio Chama north of Espanola. You're not familiar. Also formerly known as San Juan. Oweniwapinge is the Tewa name for the Central Plaza area where the people have lived for over 800 years. The area comprises 4 plazas shown here in yellow and then a racetrack to the north, which is the site of the Hammer Foot Race. At the start of the work of my former office, AOS, in 2006, There are well over 150 homes on the plazas, but less than 60 homes remained at that time, and fewer than 30 were occupied. So it's a really deep kind of, as Ted alluded to, kind of exodus from this space. And as you can see, there's power lines crisscrossing the sky, which kind of disrupts a lot of the kind of plaza needs to have that relationship with Mother Earth and Father Sky. And unlike, it faces a common list of concerns by plaguing pueblos in relation to the plazas or heart places. There is a profound and urgent need for investment in these communities. There's approximately 3,000 homes within the historic areas of Pueblo communities. The buildings, primarily of adobe construction, are deteriorating rapidly. Housing quality is very poor. There's significant overcrowding. Some of the overcrowding is cultural, as it's traditional for multiple generations to be living in the same house, but even traditionalists believe it's wrong for some of these conditions that we're faced with. Many of these communities are resource deficient and rely on HUD funding for improvement, and the funding is woefully insufficient. So there's a couple of different causes for the deterioration of these communities. The first is Portland cement. So cementitious stucco that we see throughout our urban centers, when applied to adobe, however, has a very detrimental effect. This is something that folks thought were going to really help their community, actually really cause a lot of destruction. There's an example there on the left where kind of the stucco fell down, but it exposed all the degraded adobes below, which is a result of kind of water not being able to escape. These walls need to breathe, and so a lot of the traditional plasters allow for that process. And so it makes it harder to see the condition of your walls when it's covered with stucco. And in some cases, there's like 1 inch of stucco on the outside, 1 inch of stucco on the inside, and a big void in the middle. And so that can be very risky for people living in those spaces. The other cause for deterioration is abandonment, the direct result of HUD and BIA policies that created subdivisions of Indian housing beginning in the 70s. The government plopped down thousands of the same house across America, regardless of climate or culture. Among the uninitiated consequences was a severing of complex social structures and a severe loss of language proficiency. American Indians only gained the right to control their own housing in 1996 with the passage of NAHASDA, the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. And NAHASDA paved the way for applying the traditional cultural place approach to these communities. Homes throughout the village, and this is back at Okeowenge, where experience a wide variety of conditions, continued maintenance that occurs with continual use. So you can kind of see spaces that were lived in were right next to vacant dwellings and ruins. So it made it even more difficult to kind of maintain those spaces. And so the effort that AOS engaged in just started with very humble grants. It was a preservation education program in the summer of 2006, where 6 high schoolers were trained in the ways of preservation and tribal preservation, and they surveyed their own village. They began with base drawings and that we still use. We're continuing to work with them. And this initial grant of $7,500 has now been leveraged to more than $11 million of planning and implementation funds. Our second grant-funded effort was an oral history project with the elders, through which stories of life on the plazas were remembered and recorded. Sovereignty would be the designation of the historic district. So if you're not familiar, all of the pueblos were kind of indeterminately given a historic boundary, which you can see kind of is usually a square if you look at the pueblos. But I think one thing to note is that tribal traditional boundaries, which we were able to kind of give agency to the community when self-defined, are that much more important and are an act of self-determination. So here's just some examples of Pueblo communities whose red boundary doesn't align with, yellow boundary doesn't align with the red boundaries. And just, Understanding this, I think, is a very big, important step in terms of preservation and what it means to be fit for the community to invest in that way. The determination of the Pueblo defined project, it aimed to balance preservation of the buildings and plazas while permitting contemporary life and cultural traditions to comfortably coexist. The specific preservation goals varied among community stakeholders, while OK Owenge Housing Authority, our client, sought to preserve as much of the material fabric as feasible. Tribal Council was far more interested in returning the sounds of children to the plazas. The physical preservation was secondary to them, and we've been able to do both. Another grant that we were able to kind of put towards this effort was a National Park Service grant, where we were just given time to research over 400 images in 22 repositories across the country, and we could identify the specific vantage points for about 100 of them. These photos did not guide the precise restoration, but they were essential in the community in returning their own desired cultural character. So we could actually kind of track different dwellings through time with this kind of understanding and see how they changed and what type of physical differences they underwent throughout their kind of photographic life. And we also were able to kind of determine where second stories once stood in the plazas. Not to necessarily build it back, but just to understand kind of that this was kind of the enclosure, or maybe where the sky met the earth, and just to kind of have that as an understanding, and maybe even use it as a kind of a goalpost. So in 2005, after our renovations, this is a kind of computer rendering of what it looked like. We added 21 homes and rehabilitated in the first phase. And maybe someday it might look like some of those earlier photos where there's a lot more second stories and there's a lot more intensity with the families here. But we're not really trying to kind of replicate that imagery. What we're saying is, it's not the mind of the architect, it's really the community who's reinvigorating their processes and social networks to kind of create this space. The other thing that photos do, which is really we're finding to be a big part of our preservation guidelines, are kind of asserting their will, is the windows, the openings, essentially the windows and doors, and how they're, quote, character-defining features in preservation. And we document about 8 generations of openings here for the last 130 years. The windows change from small wind doors, like actual openings, to fixed windows, to crude double hungs, New Mexico's version of Greek revival, aluminum sliders to vinyl. And so we didn't really see like specific windows being kind of codified, or like the kind of the one everyone wanted. And so this was an opportunity to kind of ask the community what they felt was appropriate for this place. And you can kind of see the green to red bars, the vertical bars. That was kind of the sweet spot. And so that ended up being a wood-clad window. So that became part of the preservation plan for the community, that all new homes would receive that type of window. Real briefly, wanting to kind of talk more about where outsiders might be looking in. The Secretary's standards are divided into 4 approaches, and the reason being that we're required to meet the Secretary's standards at OK Owenge is because we were receiving federal funds, and it was on the National Register. So if it was private philanthropy, if you're seeing individual families building their houses, that's their own money. They can do what they want. But when their federal funds come in, that triggers the requirement to satisfy these approaches. But it's kind of broken into 4 approaches. Preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction, which I think some of us might just use as the same word, but they actually mean different things. Preservation is extending the life of what remains. Rehabilitation is modernizing usage. And restoration and reconstruction is taking it back to a specific point in time, kind of thinking about that period of significance. So again, we're constantly, as trained designers, having to interpret and be the go-between for these 2 different oppositional views. And so what we thought was important was to redefine these in terms that the community used. So instead of preservation, they said, let's keep what we can. Instead of rehabilitation, let's make our homes livable. Reconstruction turned to make it look like our place. And restoration meant conserve our culture. And similarly, we kind of mapped each of these approaches out and kind of heat mapped them where red is a big conflict that the community has with what the requirements are, and green is something like, yeah, we can do that, that makes sense. You can kind of see that there's less red in rehabilitation, so that was our charge to approach it in that manner. But even then, there was still red there's still conflicts, and it required us to create memorandums with all of the different players. Okeowenge does not have a tribal historic preservation officer, so we were working with the State Historic Preservation Office, who would need to kind of usher this through the process. And so there was a lot of agreements made and to kind of utilize the traditional cultural place framework. That was what was deemed the most flexible, and everyone could kind of agree to that. So this is some of the work and how that, like, all of this policy kind of like filters into actual development and home design. So it didn't really restrict homeowner improvements like the satellite dishes. I've been aware of these since they came into, at least like Jemez and some of the rural communities in the 90s. And, it's really more of a sign of residents connecting to popular entertainment options or being like in the now, like someone's living there. I was not as offended as maybe a preservationist might be offended by these. But I think we'll probably see a lot less of them with the introduction of fiber. I think a lot of the pueblos are able to kind of get that direct line into their communities. So it'll probably go away too. But after much discussion, the leaders did want to go back to mud plaster. So at least for every adobe structure in the village, it was going to be going back to adobe mud plaster. For second stories or additions, mostly due to funding, we would do wood frame with stucco. But so that was the way that we were able to stretch our dollars and support more projects. All of this is done with the community committee who's informing us on all these policies, but also there's several different committees who are not only just talking about like what looks right, but also what is the process. It was determined through those committees, the community self-determined that they would exhaust as much money as it took to make that house livable. So not everyone gets a little bit of money, but we're going to do 4 houses right now because those houses will be moved in and lived in. So that was the strategy they took, and this is what they felt was appropriate. Similarly, there's a kind of a detail up top that's coping. We are not having earthen roofs. We don't have like 2 feet of roof. What we're doing is TPO kind of a membrane that needs to terminate somehow, some way with this kind of natural earthen plaster. And one idea was maybe in the image. This is the image of Acoma. They use flagstone to kind of terminate, give it some kind of protection from the rain, but let that kind of membrane kind of butt up against it. But the community here said, no, we never did that here, so we don't want to do that. And so they opted for a more modern material, a metal kind of coping, and you can kind of see that up top. So that's just, these are the kinds of things that you don't think about when you're thinking grand scale, but they do factor into how this place looks and feels when we're leaving the space. So today we've completed 45 rehabilitations. This is kind of a look. One of the most captivating things of this image to me is the removal of power lines. I think that's a huge difference in the way that these spaces feel. And some of the images of the work that right after that first phase in 2006, and we'll just go through some quick before and afters. You can kind of see how the footprints were maintained, the adobes are maintained, and we just kind of return them to these spaces that kind of resemble their origins, but are also very modern. You can see in that last one, there was not really a splash block because you don't want the water washing the earthen plaster off the wall. And so that's when they allowed us to put flagstones to kind of prohibit that erosion. You can see kind of the conditions. I think I see a lot of times people thinking, this is irreparable. It's done, just demo it. And it's like, no, actually, there's still a lot of life. Your walls are very, robust. This is, I don't know how many man hours of labor that Ted went into the development of these communities, but they're still very strong. As they say, has good bones. You can kind of see how, some of the same locations now have new memories because they're revitalized. And in some cases, we were able to add second stories for expanding families. Another kind of feel-good moment about this is the construction was led by Avanyu, a native-owned, woman-owned business from nearby San Alfonso. We wrote in requirements for local training, hiring, and project specifications. While more than half of the crew are native, with many members from Okewingi, the project returned well over $1 million in construction salaries to the community. This is not something that should be overlooked, and I think it should happen more and more regardless of adobe earthen construction. Some of the early collaborators went on to find work in careers in the field, and many of those who worked on this project are now sought after for their expertise in earthen architecture. Here are some of the images. I'm very particularly proud of my stair design in that center top, and some of the plaster work. It even made its way out to the Architectural Biennale in 2019, and that's me in Venice in front of the work. I think it's safe to say that laughter has returned to the village, and I think that it's also important to recognize that the preservation community is also taking that as a cover image for their publication, and also we're able to kind of look at how this technology, as we all kind of just know that it's super, it comes from a very important place, but in terms of carbon emissions, buildings account for 40% of carbon emissions worldwide. They're responsible for 55% of the world's electricity usage, 5% water usage, 50% of raw and value-added materials. But more and more design schools are tackling this problem and finding ways to work creatively and scientifically to find carbon neutrality. So the current stucco on a wood frame construction, which is on the right side there, it generates more than 120 pounds of CO2 equivalent in its full life carbon cycle. Whereas Adobe just results in 30 pounds, so that's the line above the horizontal. But because there's a lot of biogenetic storage in like the vigas and some of the organic material in the soil, there's actually carbon sequestering. So it's actually carbon positive. So it's actually taking carbon out of the system. So it's a really, if we were to add science to it, which we already knew, we can start to model these ideas and really be more kind of in tune with technology trends. And so for the future of Okewingi, it continues to evolve at the discretion of the tribe. We submitted 2 major grants to the federal government to fund the next 2 phases of construction. One phase will complete the remaining rehabilitations, which is blue on the map, and the other will focus on construction of 15 new homes in the village. It's the first time we're approaching new homes, shown in yellow. This aerial perspective shows an early concept for some of the new homes in the main plaza. If you remember those kind of photos in second stories, that's where it's really taking its cues from. Whereas the Biden administration climate initiatives define HUD grants to be prioritizing carbon positive, carbon neutral construction, the current administration, unfortunately, is bringing budgets forward right now that will cut much of the HUD funding that made this work possible. We continue to hold out hope, though, that other resources could be found and we can revitalize the decision making that sees the value of these places being stewarded by their communities. I did want to kind of also just pose some questions and lessons learned. Would it be appropriate to leave this conversation feeling, oh, this is the solution for all? What we're just defining here is a lifestyle change. Mud plastering the homes is a big effort, endeavor, expense. What was recently a quiet area with mostly one-person household is now full of life, noise, and stuff. The stuff of 45 families of varying size. So how do we balance modern life with this sacred place? The 2010 preservation plan has been adopted into a master land use plan, but consensus still leads the community on the question of guidelines versus standards. How should self-funded rehabilitation and additions be managed compared to UHA or Housing Authority funded projects? There's mixed messages where the Kivas here in this community are still using stabilized adobes, which have stucco applied to them, whereas the homes are not able to kind of utilize that. So it's kind of a bit contentious. But also, again, making it so that the families that are required to maintain their mud plaster, there's been a lot of effort in training, and giving the know-how to these families, but that funding has run out, so that's really a time for them to be taking the initiative, and we'll see soon how that's working. So I think those are some thoughts to think about, especially as you navigate the exhibit. But I also wanted to kind of highlight some of the data work that goes into a lot of this. I think it's obvious to see that we're really in our role ambitious about bringing concepts in visual form. And a lot of our work is driven by the need to visualize concepts and develop clear pictures to make decisions. We find that providing tribal communities with clear data helps to reinforce the goals of cultural, physical, and community welfare. With more on that, Miriam's going to talk about some of the work we've done at Zoo.
Yeah, so as Garron kind of touched on earlier, there on tribal lands and often all over Indian country, there's a need for accurate tribal housing data. So again, 40% of on-reservation housing is considered substandard compared to 6% outside of Indian country. Nearly 1/3 of homes on reservations are overcrowded, but that's often due to cultural differences, and less than half of the homes on reservations are connected to public sewer systems, and 16% often lack indoor plumbing. And in 2017, while at AOS Architects, the Zuni Housing Authority released an RFP, which is a request for a proposal. So they wanted to assess every lived-in structure on the entire reservation, with their goal, again, being to collect info on housing data. What are the number of homes? What's their condition? What's the infrastructure? Are there any accessibility needs, life safety concerns, overcrowding? And use all this data to, again, challenge census data as well. So HUD, the HUD Indian Housing Block Grant uses a formula to determine the funding that's received through both the ICDBG and then the IHBG, and then also through Section 184 loans. So here's kind of a snapshot of what that formula looks like. And they're looking again for households which are either overcrowded or without a kitchen or without plumbing. So many kind of previous housing surveys, again, were documented manually on paper and clipboards. So this kind of meant later that there's many staff hours later where they have to plug all this information back into a database back in the office. But at this time, we kind of asked ourselves, well, how can we make this more efficient to build data collection? So we had applied for a National Park Service grant in 2016 to really research a better method for digital data collection. And we were able to use a mobile app service called Fulcrum to help kind of build this digital database, collect information through photos, interviews, surveys, all on one platform, so we can kind of streamline this process. So here's kind of a snapshot where we took information that we would need to collect from HUD forms, possibly information from the New Mexico Historic Preservation Division, and then the National Register of Historic Places. and then built all this, again, in a living database. So we spent 4 months working collaboratively with the Housing Authority in Zuni to develop the ideal survey form. And it was broken down into 4 parts. Part A, looking at the physical exteriors of the homes. Part B, collecting information from the residents. So asking them questions about, is your heat working? Do you have running water? How many folks are living here in the home? Part C was us doing assessments of the interior, so looking at those mechanical power plumbing systems, looking at conditions of the walls, if they would let us go inside. And then part D was kind of aligning more in-office data entry, so collecting kind of any previous data that the Housing Authority had, and then also any kind of past information about national district locations, so putting this all into one form. I think the survey had over 250 total questions, which would be a very lengthy assessment, but again, this built off all the past efforts that the tribe had already undertaken, so those efforts were not forgotten, and kind of, again, just wanted to include this all in the app itself. So this is kind of an example of how the survey looks on an iPad, where each section is kind of parsed out into different categories. And because we wanted to be efficient, because there were a lot of homes on the reservation that we had to assess, I had coded it to have like either a full survey if the resident said, oh yeah, I have all the time in the world to sit with you and talk about my house and help with the assessment. And then there's a quick version if you're like, no, I only have 10 minutes. Okay, then we would shrink all the questions so that we can only collect that kind of top level survey data. And we had actually hired and trained 3 Zuni tribal members to help complete these assessments. So here's some images of them there. They all had kind of different backgrounds. One had a background in construction, another used to work for the county as a canvas worker. And then the gentleman on the left, Lee Lucia, he was actually a former tribal police officer, which was a little difficult at first because people knew who he was, and they're like, why is this guy poking around our house? It's like, I'm like, is he gonna do a raid or something? But eventually word got out through radio announcements and people just talking in the community that no, this is a good thing. Nobody's in trouble. We're just trying to collect data on the houses and their conditions. So eventually, by the 3rd month, everybody was reaching out to them. Hey, like, when are you going to come to my house and do the survey? So we had again used existing GIS E911 address data. So we kind of pinned all the locations or front doors for all the homes already. And I kind of divided all of these pins to the different assessors. So our assessors eventually went out in the fields and collected living data over 9 months in the process, and they engaged almost every resident on the reservation. So the pins shown in the screenshots kind of show all those geolocated homes with different colors, showing that red means that they got to the exteriors only. Yellow, meaning that they got to do exteriors and then also look inside. So. But the inventory had documented different housing typologies also found in Zuni. So this included multi-story stone homes found in the historic Middle Village, also HUD homes, different types of owner-built homes, and then I guess manufactured homes like tough sheds also were collected. And then different scattered structures and kind of outlying farm districts. But, sorry, we'll speed up. So I'll kind of breeze through. So critical to the success again of this initiative was, us being consistent in our evaluations. Defining what's, no deficiencies versus major. So overall, we had collected data on over 1,850 homes. Assessing every lived-in structure on the entire reservation. So here's kind of a snapshot of what that looked like. We found again that 64% of the homes were in fair or good condition, while 36% of the homes were in poor to severe. And so here's kind of a zoomed in image of the middle village, what those kind of conditions look like mapped. So this data again provided us insights into 4 patterns of construction and building design, so we can again, figure out homes that were incomplete, what would kind of have more deterioration and active leaks versus those that were finished. So again, the database provided the tribe now with a newfound ability to target investment. So several homes that were found with critical life safety issues during the project were demoed and kind of rebuilt. And this kind of self-determined approach taken by the Housing Authority enabled a more proactive investment to provide a healthy, safe living environment for an elder at risk in this case. And again, with the demographic information that we collected, we can integrate more kind of generational planning and thinking into our data investigation. So we can now query the data, find homes where elders don't have, working heats, find where children are maybe living with leaking roofs or if there's mold concerns. But ultimately, this project is, as much about policy as it is about design and construction. So the architects kind of offered further recommendations to the Tribal Council and Housing Authority to think more strategically about designing, detailing, building, and completing homes in the future. So again, there's more recommendations that we provided, to right size the homes, design it better, detail it, build it, and then again try to complete the home itself. But at the end of the project, we actually turned over the whole app and database to the Housing Authority. So today, the Housing Authority is working on training additional staff to continue their data collection in the app, as well as gathering more data on the Middle Village right now. So we're excited. This app is such a successful tool that builds upon data sovereignty and empowers the tribe and its people.
Yeah, I think we're getting close to time, but I did want to say this work does continue right now. We are working in the Middle Village, so this is kind of the latest image to kind of recognize that we are re-evaluating a lot of the surveys that were done about 10 years ago, 2012, 13 years ago. Jeez. But you can kind of see that the buildings are numbered as buildings, not individual units. There's about 125 homes in this space, but we have probably about 80-some buildings. And so that's really intentional to kind of recognize that these are shared spaces. Walls for some may mean a communal space for others. So just wanting to kind of be able to kind of speak to that. We did have another project to show, but in another time we'll keep it here. Maybe we can jump to the last slide. But thank you all for your sustained interest. As you can see, we could probably talk all day on this subject. It is something that is, again, very near and dear to our work. Thank you.
We might have time for maybe 2 questions.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask, just from you guys' work, the impacts of wage economy and into the Pueblo community and the impacts of maintaining those types of homes, in your experience, what you guys see? Because when I was in Laguna, one of the big issues that we had there was getting people to actually go through and maintain that challenging, difficult work of maintaining the homes because they were going to work. So, their lifestyle completely changed in that manner. But I was curious if you could shed some light on some of that.
Yeah, I think the question is related to kind of the present day economies and how people are able to kind of spend the effort, time, and money to maintain homes that once upon a time were not, needing this kind of financial effort. It was mostly sweat equity, mostly community coming together. It's kind of beautiful story at Okeowenge. Some people would gift a newlywed couple their vigas, almost like a down payment to build a new space. I think it's a challenge, definitely. With the way that federal funding worked, we had to actually show receipts for everything we bought, which is a bit challenging when you're using earth, but we were required to do that, so we had to buy blocks from Santa Fe, for instance. So those had to be, attributed to that home. I think when in the latter phases where we're at now, we're getting a lot of philanthropy money, which is really awesome because it kind of frees you from a lot of those restrictions. But that is also a challenge in the sense that the restrictions are lifted. Do we still kind of work the same way we have? Or do we kind of focus on bringing community together to build these homes? It's a very difficult thing to navigate. I'm sure you very well understand that from being Diné in Laguna, myself being Jemez and Okeawenge is no different. I can't tell them what to do or tell them how to do things. I think the community spoke about them wanting to return to mud plaster, but that is still, as I kind of mentioned in my afterthoughts, still a little bit controversial and a challenge to get people to take on that responsibility. I think the future of it in my mind would be to be able to kind of create workforce crews. I think there's some organization with that. There could be some leveraging kind of, I guess maybe kind of systematizing things that were just done in social relationship ways to be able to kind of find funding support, find strategy for scheduling, and like really kind of organize it in a way that works with the capital system that we have now. That to me seems kind of like where we can kind of position grassroots organizations to kind of support. It's interesting, they also in the latest group, there are some people, do-gooders, who want to come and like do service in these communities. One example was Google had a retreat and they made blocks. So now they have blocks that they call Google blocks. But there's different strategies, but it's all dependent on the community. So yeah, it's a case by case kind of answer.
One more.
I have a quick question. And thank you, this is like marvelous. We don't, our housing authorities, we can't really have a few exceptions. So there's a lot to be learned from, housing problems. But anyway, I think I remember from Okeawenge that there's actually a new school down there as well and a library. And I'm just wondering about the importance of that for like young families to come back to those.
Yeah, I think and so my last project was Kiwa. There needs to be these kind of concerted planning efforts to be able to kind of also meet those needs, as you mentioned. And I think that was very much thought about at Okeawenge. Was hoping to highlight how that was thought about for a new subdivision of new construction housing at Kiwa. But I think also, being able to kind of have that long range planning or this risk and hazards people call blue sky thinking is such a challenge in this time when there's not enough funds, there's people knocking on doors, the wait list is beyond 10 years. So it's really difficult for these housing authorities or housing entities to prioritize that type of thinking and to leverage it with planning, engineering, construction, economic development, which I say our communities did since time immemorial. So that reconnecting those kinds of philosophies and thinkings, I think is where we need to kind of position our work. And I think what we wanted to highlight is that we have a lot of technical know-how, but we're here as a service for people who want to do those types of things.
Let's thank our presenters once again. I'm just going to lead people on the tour through the exhibit. If you'll meet